Lodgepole. I'm sorry that we're not together in person again today, but I'm happy to go ahead and record this session for you. We are going to be discussing a few of the same things that we talked about last session. We will start by reviewing the basics of the ACT. Were we together, we would be talking about what things stood out to you, things that make you feel a little bit nervous, and things that you are confident about. So in this case, I'll be asking you to write and reflect on some of those things. Please, at this time, if you did not grab a pen and paper, pause the video and do so now. After we go through some of those questions, as well as some basic test-taking strategies, we are going to dive into the English practice exam that we talked about last week, the one that you have in hand, and actually apply some of those strategies to that passage. Hopefully you have been through it one time already and answered some of those questions yourself. If not, you are welcome to do so first. Again, pause the recording, read through it so that you feel ready before we talk about it at that time. We will go through the reading passage from Exam 1 as well. Hopefully you have read that at this time as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about the essay. I also am not entirely sure about your experience with timed writing. Were we together, I would get some of that information and find out where to go from there. But as it is, we'll just talk about some essay writing basics. And I'd like to offer you the opportunity to actually write that essay in a timed setting. So be honest with yourself, set a timer, write within the allotted time. And you are then welcome to send that essay to me, and I can provide you with some feedback and ideas about how to write more efficiently, more coherently in a timed setting. I would also like to spend some time assessing the sample essays on the ACT website. However, as that is something that would be better accomplished together, I would simply like you to read that essay in preparation for our next session, read the samples, and try to determine for yourself why each sample received the score that it did. That's what we're going to accomplish today. If you need any materials, again, please pause the video, grab them now, and here we go. If you did have the opportunity to watch the video from our last session, the first thing that I would like you to do is pause the video and reflect briefly for about 5 minutes on the things that stood out to you. This will tell you a little bit about what you are most anxious about going into the test and things that you're confident about so that you can sort of prioritize or triage your own study efforts. Knowing what you know and what you are confident in is a really, really great way to focus your efforts over the coming weeks. Please also think about not only things that stood out to you as interesting, difficult, things you're confident about. Take this time to also jot down questions for me. You are welcome to send these as an email to me after this video session is over. Please pause the video now. All right, so one of the major things that we talked about last session is the difference between a standard classroom test and the ACT. They both have test in the name, but they are very different beasts, so to speak, and they perform a very different function. When you are sitting in a classroom test, often, not always, often your teacher will be using that information to decide how to shape the classroom in the weeks to come. But the ACT is measuring things as they are, measuring your ability to use the knowledge that you have and apply it to the content that is in the book. So before we move on any further, I'd like you to take maybe a minute and a half and write down, if you did not do this last time, things that happen when you take a classroom test. Please pause the video and write about that now. So a few things that you may have chosen to write about are things that are expected of you in a classroom test, how you usually prepare for a classroom test, what happens on test day, how your classroom tests are evaluated, and your experiences with timed writing. You may have noted that you're often expected to recall specific information in a classroom test. So say, for instance, you did a reading, you might need to know the date that a certain event happened to a certain character, or you might need to recall a specific instance of symbolism that you talked about in the book. You probably prepare by going back over the specific information that you learned in class. On test day, there's a chance that you might have access to peers in class or to your book. Tests are usually scored according to your individual teacher. Hopefully those expectations are made, clear to you ahead of time, but it certainly depends on the item. And of course, your experience with timed writing might vary depending on what you've worked on in class. Based on those things, it's really helpful to know that the ACT is fundamentally different than other tests you may have taken before. Again, we talked about this last session, but I cannot emphasize enough how very important it is to answer every question on the exam. That might not be the case in other standardized tests that you've taken before. Some tests will detract a quarter point, a full point for answers that are wrong, but that's not the case on the ACT. So if you have choices A through D and you take a wild guess, you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right. Whereas if you leave it blank, you absolutely get it wrong. So bear in mind there's no wrong answer penalty. It also doesn't matter how you arrive at the correct answer. So for instance, some of your math exams or science exams, or even maybe in your English classroom, your instructor will be looking for your outline on an essay, or maybe the work that got you to your answer on a math problem. On the ACT, that doesn't matter. As long as you can find the right answer where it is on the page, that's all that counts. The ACT is primarily a test of application rather than a test of knowledge. So what that means is, rather than recalling the specific dates and details that you might need in those English classes, you will be asked to apply the skills that you've learned. So of course you will need to know some information from your English class, but being able to put that in practice and use it to find the correct response is more important. Again, everything is on the page. You just have to apply the information you've got. Sort of in that realm of scoring, we'll go over scores and score distributions again momentarily. But before we do, regarding that no wrong answer penalty, if you were to work only half of the problems and get them all right, and then guess on the other half, statistically you'd probably get about a 23, which is in the top quarter of everyone who takes the test. If you were to hurry up and answer every single question, but you only got half of them right, you'd get about a 19, which is in the bottom 50%, which just helps to emphasize the importance of strategically responding to questions on this exam. Just really quickly, talked about this before, but I want to make sure that you do have this information to sort of help alleviate any anxiety you might have about what this test will look like. The ACT includes 4 different subjects plus a writing test, which you probably know. English will be 45 minutes, 75 questions. Math is 60 minutes, 60 questions. Reading is 35 minutes, 40 questions. Science, 35 minutes, 40 questions. And in writing, you have 40 minutes to write that essay question. Sounds pretty fast, and that's because it is. So if you find yourself starting to run out of time, we'll talk about a couple things you can do in that instance, but always make sure before that time is up that you have every answer bubble filled in. Your English test will be scored on a scale of 1 to 36. Half of that 1 to 18 is based on usage and mechanics. So those grammar rules that we're, all sort of expected to know. The other half, 18 points, is allocated to rhetorical skills. So that means being able to think about the best way to communicate an idea in the most efficient way possible. The reading test, again, is scored on a scale of 1 to 36. There are 4 passages that you'll read. They are always social studies, science, art, and literature. Social studies and sciences are scored together out of 18. Arts and literature scored together out of 18. The essay is also scored on a scale of 1 to 36, but it's broken down a little bit differently. So if you have certain strengths in your writing that you know you are really good at, you can feel confident knowing that you have some of these points in the bag. So ideas and analysis scored on 1 to 12. Development and support, that means providing valid and clear reasoning for your argument, 1 to 12. Organization, 1 to 12, making sure your ideas are written in a way that makes sense, in an order that makes sense. And language use and conventions, a lot of that stuff that you'll find on the English part of the exam is also 1 to 12. You might notice that your writing score is not calculated into your composite score, which on one hand can be a really good thing or a really bad thing depending on the outcome. But some colleges will use it for either admissions purposes or placement in their writing program, so it does matter. The number of correct responses in each section is called your raw score, which the ACT board then turns into your scaled scores, which are the scores that are seen on your score report. This is because the ACT administers different versions of the test, and so this helps make sure that they are scored fairly and evenly across the board. Scaled scores range from that basic 1 to 36. Most people score from that 17 to 23. So thinking back, if you were to answer half the questions correctly, guess on the other half you're going to get, likely, not a promise, there's a statistically good chance that you'll get that 23. To earn a 20, which is smack dab in the middle of that range, it's only necessary to get 53% of the answers correct. Your composite score is the unweighted average of those 4 section scores. Going back and talking a little bit about your mindset going into the test. Remember that you earn points for knowing where the answer is on the page. It's not like a standard classroom test where you have to think, do I remember this information? Instead, it's much more helpful to go into it thinking, I can figure this out using a variety of different strategies, whether that's elimination or a triage strategy. Again, it doesn't matter how you get to that right answer. English does lean a little bit more toward kind of an understanding of some of the rules. Reading leans a little bit more toward application. But overall, the exam is about applying what you've learned. So when you're looking at an ACT question, there are a few things you may want to consider. Since there's a chance you might not get to all of them, you'll want to think, do I want to answer this question? Or should I guess and move on? If it's a question that you feel there's no chance that you're going to get the right answer, that's okay. You are welcome to guess and move on to a question that you do know how to answer. You may also ask yourself, is this something that I might be able to answer if I came back to it? Once I've warmed up, once I've answered a few more questions. And then you'll also want to think, what strategy can I apply to this question? Also be sure to think of the ACT sections like 5 separate lives, basically, each of the different subject tests. So while you're in the English exam, just think English. While you're in the science exam, just think science. Of course, go back and rework sections, reread passages within that exam, but it's not helpful to have your mind in science land when you're working on an English passage. Talked about this a little bit last time, but triage strategy means deciding which questions are worth most of your time right off the bat. In English and reading, you should work each passage as a block. You'll have several different pieces of reading to do. So you'll want to make sure that you have finished a passage before you move on to the next, because questions are often related to one another. You might find the answer to one question in a question that appears later. So on your first pass through each passage, answer the ones that are easy, guess at the ones that are impossible, skip those questions that you can answer with extra time. On the second pass through each passage, return to questions you skipped, and be sure that you're paying attention to per passage time. So if you have 40 minutes and 4 passages, that means you'll need to allocate about 10 minutes to each. The English exam specifically is 45 minutes, 75 questions. You're right. That is a lot of questions in 45 minutes, involving punctuation, mechanics, and other editing questions. Do keep in mind as we're working through some of these English questions that it's not a matter of preference, which can be really, really hard for student writers, probably such as yourselves who have been encouraged to take risks and make decisions about your writing. However, in this case, the ACT expects you to conform by the technically correct rules. So, you may just have to kind of bite the bullet in this case and choose the answer that you know is technically correct, even if you might not include it in your own writing. That is the way to succeed on some of those questions in the ACT. Be sure that you read every word of the sentence that you are planning to change. The ACT is often tricky, and they will include information maybe after a page break that will make a sentence either correct or incorrect. It's easy also to jump ahead to reading the answers before you finished reading the question, and you may have 2 answers that look correct. One of them is only the correct choice because of the end of that sentence that you maybe didn't read in the first place. So read every piece of information. One handy trick, handy strategy is to look for verbose writing. If you don't know what that means, it's overly wordy writing, which we tend to employ in classroom writing sometimes, especially if your instructor says, I need 3 pages about this topic, and you only have 2.5 pages, and so you think of the longest way to express an idea. I know I've done it, and I know you've probably done it too. On the ACT, you want to find the shortest way that is still correct. Avoid redundancy. On the same vein, words that are repeated, ideas that mean basically the same thing in the same sentence. So although vocabulary isn't explicitly tested on the ACT, you will need to know how to correctly use words so you can identify when a writer is repeating themselves. One really important strategy to use in both English and reading is to write on your test booklet. So I'd like you to take maybe 3 minutes and brainstorm different things that you might be able to write in the margins that could help you correctly answer those, respond to those questions. Think about your first pass through the English exam, the microscope in the kitchen, as you are responding. 3 minutes, things you can write in the margins, go. Right, so you may have noted that one of the things that you can include in your margin notes is main ideas. Other things you can look for are transitions. You can also look for structure and language patterns within the text. Common transition words to look for include, however, by contrast, on the contrary, conversely, meanwhile, although, nevertheless, therefore, thus, for example, to illustrate, in fact, on the contrary, on the other hand, additionally, moreover, in that sense, as, secondly, finally, in addition, in summary, and in contrast. You don't need to necessarily memorize that list or be able to rattle it off, but you should be able to identify that these words signal we're moving on to another idea. This is important because in this test, the exam will often ask you to find a better transition or think about how ideas are connected. This tells you places to look for that information. Few other tricky little things to look for. One strategy can be to actually identify these specific kinds of questions if you have mastered these sort of little content areas. But you want to identify words that sound alike. They'll try to trick you with the should've, would've, could've, when often it's easy to say should, of, would, of, could, of. Know that the second part of that is have, should have, would have, could have. There will also be tricky uses of the word to be. And you'll also want to be aware of parallelism, which if you have a mathematical mind is easy to find because it's sort of like a distribution problem. Parallelism is basically when the parts of a sentence are constructed in the same way. So you can track that pattern and make sure that the last part follows the first. There's an example of that you probably found in the microscope in the kitchen example, and we can identify that a little bit later as we move on. All right, and in the English exam, there are a few little things. If you look up and you notice that you are running out of time, you can look for specific line references and do those questions because it tells you exactly where to go back and look. You can refer to cited information. Cited means quoted or borrowed information. So again, sending you back to a specific part of the passage, and answer those questions as best you can with the information that you find there. And finally, just make sure that you answer every single question, fill in every single bubble, because there's no penalty for a wrong answer. It won't detract points away from you. All right, so at this time, we are going to go back and review the practice exam that we worked on last time. Hopefully you have looked at this passage already and answered some of the questions on the ACT practice website. The awesome thing about that site is that it tells you not only whether or not you have answered a question correctly, but it tells you why. So you can start to identify things that you may or may not be as comfortable with. You're welcome to copy and paste this link. The next slide also includes a link to the site that we're going to. Or simply Google ACT English Practice, and it'll be the first option that comes up. So we did go through a few of these questions last session. I would encourage you to return to them. However, in order to practice one strategy that we're talking about today, writing in the margins, I would like you to read through this passage once more, and I would like you to jot down information that you think can help you get to the right answers. Should be fairly easy because we've looked through this once before, but think about things that would point you toward those answers. Remember that those ideas can be main ideas, transitions, structures, or other things that you find important that you will want to remember. Please take maybe 5 minutes approximately and work through that passage now. Okay. So you may have jotted down for the main idea of this first paragraph that the theme is the narrator's childhood experience. May have been the tone of their childhood home. You may have also made a couple notes about the use of commas in that first paragraph. You may have noticed a little bit of redundancy near number 5. Moving down into the second paragraph, there's a chance that that little language instinct in the back of your brain went, wait, we're jumping into another idea. Why are we talking about this person's mother and then the moon affecting the tides? Maybe this is a place where we'll be looking for a transition. Based on some of the information we talked about just a few minutes ago, you might see a tricky use of the verb to be, the moon being. You might also be alert to the uses of its and its with an apostrophe and without. One of those tricky little rules that they'll try to get you with, so pay attention to things like that. And you might also notice some redundant language, some places where that author is repeating themselves. You may have also jotted down that this paragraph relates the narrator's experience to the tides. In the next paragraph, you may have noticed that the word often is signaling a transition to a conversation about a specific experience. I see another tricky instance of the verb to be, not to be seen. And you may have noted that the main topic or theme of that paragraph has to do with this narrator's experience with his brother. All right, take a couple more minutes. If you're noticing patterns that you did not notice before, something that you'd like to include in the final paragraph, I would like you to pause the video again, add to your notes if you would like to do so. Right, so you may have noticed that at this point we are returning back to talking about the narrator's mother. If you are paying attention to notions of structure, thinking about how this thing's been organized, you might notice that we're going back to something that we talked about in the beginning. You may also notice uses of the verb to be. And by now, you should also be getting a sense of the narrator's main idea and the theme of the piece as a whole. Using that information, and without looking at your answers from last time, I would like you to go through and respond to these questions once more. And I would like you to line up the question with the paragraph where you found the answer. See if you made a note that helped you with that answer. And now, just to show you, if you haven't had a chance to actually use this function, I am going to show you what this page looks like and the sort of explanations that it gives you for perhaps mistakes that you have made. So please note that I am not choosing the correct answers at this time, so I can show you the way this practice test communicates those answers to you. You'll scroll down and click Answer. And we'll scroll back up to the top. And you'll see that it explains not only that answer, but it tells you about the rule. It tells you why or why not a semicolon will be used, why or why not a comma would be used. Make a note of the kinds of questions that you find you're getting wrong. We talked about this a little bit last week, but you can write down things that are memorization issues. You can talk about things that are human error. Like, I knew the right answer and I filled in the wrong bubble. And you can make a note of things that are tricky questions. So when it's clear that it is simply to confuse you, and keep track of the kinds of tricks that you're more or less likely to fall for, as it were. If you scroll back up to the top with me, you'll notice that there are 1, 2, 3 different pages of questions for passage 1. Let's click on number 2. Notice that the passage hasn't changed, but we have another set of questions. I'd like you to pause the video now, answer these questions as well, connecting them with the information that you've included in the margins. This time, adding to that information, thinking about what maybe would have been helpful to know or to notice as you read through that passage. And after you've completed that, I would like you to this time do a self-check using the correcting function that I showed you, because there are several of these practice tests available on this site, and I would very much like you to be able to go back and keep track of the places where you are finding that you are getting confused. So please answer those questions. Make a note of what was challenging, and please also make a note of what was surprising. If there are any explanations to those questions that you don't understand, that's okay, because I'm here to help. So jot down that rule or that language and send it to me in an email. I'm very available by email to address your specific questions and help you be as successful as possible. After you've completed those questions, same thing for number 3, if you have not done so already. Pause the video, please do so now. Okay. I'm really interested in knowing what is comfortable for you and what is not, so please share that information with me. The reading exam, 35 minutes, 40 questions, a little bit fewer questions, but more reading. Again, you'll be reading prose fiction, social studies, natural sciences, and humanities kinds of passages. I would recommend starting with the kind of passage that you prefer, because there's a really good chance that you'll get those questions right. If you know you're good at reading science, start with science. If you know that you prefer reading fiction stories, start with fiction. Because the more correct answers you can get, the fewer you have to guess at, the better. There are a couple of different strategies that I'd like to tell you about. One is the 3-passage strategy. One is skimming and scanning. A couple other really important strategies are active reading, which hopefully is something that you do in your classroom reading anyway. If not, it'd be a great thing to start practicing. Active reading means you ask yourself questions about the reading as you go. So you might ask yourself about the author's purpose and choices. What is the author trying to do, and why did they write it in the way that they did? You might, similar to the English part of the exam, be asking yourself about the general outline of the piece. So why did we start in the future when the story didn't actually begin until much later? The narrator, isn't even born until 4 paragraphs later. And issues of structure within the paragraphs as well. That's by no means a comprehensive list of questions that you can ask yourself, but anything that you think, interesting, may lead you to ask about the author's purpose and intents. This is somewhere between skimming and close reading. Close reading is when you really carefully examine each idea, and skimming is when you just sort of read through as quickly as you can for the main ideas. This is somewhere in between. It's still really fast, but you're gleaning more information than you would when you're skimming. Another great strategy in the reading exam is passage mapping, which is very, very similar to the note-taking that we just practiced in the English part of the exam. So this is, again, taking notes in the margins, in this case, specifically about the purpose of each paragraph. So what does that mean? Well, samples of some of those purposes might include stating the thesis, establishing the tone, providing supporting argument, providing evidence, giving an opinion, providing a counter-argument, giving the backstory, history, and many, many more. Again, that's not a comprehensive list, but it's some of the things that you might note regarding the purpose of a paragraph. Pay especially close attention to the first and the last paragraph of the piece, because those tend to do different things, and they can tell you a lot about the overall tone and the purpose of a piece of writing as a whole. Another great strategy is to look at only complete 3 of the 4 passages and guess on one. So you would guess on all 10 questions for your least favorite passage, then jump to your favorite passage because you know you're probably going to get almost all of those correct. Answer those, then move on to your second, then move on to your third, and if you're running out of time, guess for the ones that you haven't been able to get to. I would highly recommend that you make a prediction about what the answer will be before you even read the answers, because one of the tricky things that the ACT might try to do is give you an answer in the responses that looks correct, but it actually answers a different question altogether. It's really easy to read the first few words of a question and then glance down and see, oh, that answer looks right, when really it's not. So think in your mind, read the entire question, think to yourself what the answer might be, and then see if there's something that aligns with that in the answers. It's a much more surefire way to make sure you're answering the right question. Answers must also be completely true, especially when you get a question that is about making an inference, where you have to make a judgment about something that's not in the text based on the information that you have. It's not correct to find one that's maybe mostly true. The correct answer to an inference question is always 100% true based on the information in the text. So we're going to jump into the reading practice exam. Again, we're going to do the same one that you did for last session. This time using passage mapping strategy. You can either copy and paste the link, click on the link in the slideshow, or jump over to the window that you have open and click on reading. We're again working on passage 1. Without looking at your responses from last time, if you worked through this passage already, I would like you to read through it once more, and I would like you to make notes in the margin about the purpose of each paragraph. Please take about 5 minutes and do so now. Okay. Similar to our work with the English portion of the exam, I would now like you to respond to these questions on the right, including the ones we talked about last time, without looking at your answers. And I would like you to correlate those responses. I'd like you to connect those responses with the notes that you made in the margins. Okay, and again, I am clicking through to show you the language that the ACT provides you. Once you've completed your answers and made a note of what questions go with which notes you've made in the margins, click Answer. And try to think about, again, the types of mistakes you may have made, things that are challenging for you, things that you are very confident about. And I'd like you to look, and if any of the language in these responses does not make sense to you, if any of these rules are confusing, I would like you to please, please, please reach out, ask me about that. We can specifically address those issues together. Probably noticed in this question some of the same language that we used to talk about it last week. Hopefully you also made some sort of note about the narrator's perspective in your margin notes. So jumping into this first paragraph here, right off the bat you might have noticed that the author talks about the main character as he, which is telling us that this whole thing is going to be in third-person point of view. Tells us this isn't a guy talking about himself. This is someone coming in from the outside. Right. So please take another 3 minutes or so. Respond to the questions on page 2. Again, you'll have pages 1 and 2 beneath passage 1 under the reading tab at the top. And please complete the second set of questions as well. Please be sure to make a note of where you found each answer in your margin notes and the kinds of mistakes that you find you are making. Okay, let's take a closer look at number 7. Includes a couple of things that we talked about you can do when you're running out of time. So if you find you're at this point and you need to move on, 2 things that are happening in this question. We see that it's an inference question because the question starts, it can reasonably be inferred. We also see that it cites or refers to a specific place in the text. So it's really easy for you to jump right back in. You don't have to reread the whole thing. You can go right to where it's telling you to look. So it can reasonably be inferred from the first paragraph that in obtaining outside funding for the community center, Abshu could be characterized as, note that we read the entire question. If you just read the first half of that question, there's a really good chance that you would choose the wrong answer. We'll be sure to read all of the questions. Before we do, kind of think to yourself, maybe even jot down a prediction for what that answer might be. If you need to refer back to that first paragraph, which you probably do, and that's okay, you can go back and look at it again. Clifford Jackson, or Abshu as he preferred to be known in the streets, had committed himself several years ago to use his talents as a playwright to broaden the horizons for the young, gifted, and black, which was how he saw every child milling around that dark street. As head of the community center, he went after every existing grant on the city and state level to bring them puppet shows with a message to avoid drugs and stay in school, and plays in the park such as actors rapping their way through Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Abshu believed there was something in Shakespeare for everyone, even the young of Brewster Place, and if he broadened their horizons just a little bit, there might be enough room for some of them to slip through and see what the world had waiting. No, It would not be a perfect world, but definitely one with more room than they had now. So we'll go ahead and read. Hopefully now you have your prediction made. We'll read the answers. Abshu could be characterized as thorough in seeking out potential sources for financial backing, reluctant to spoil the children with charity, excited about having the children write grant applications, determined to let the children decide how the money would be spent. Remember that an inference question has to be 100% true. So although there are several questions that might be half true, every part of that response has to be correct. Through process of elimination, we can determine that, well, he's not having the children write the grant applications. It would appear that he is writing them. Doesn't look like the children are making the decisions about how the money would be spent. If he's bringing them puppet shows, encouraging them to not do drugs, if he wants to offer them every opportunity, would he be reluctant to spoil the children with charity? That'd be one instance in which a little bit of vocabulary would come in. But it seems that he doesn't have much of an issue providing these children with opportunities. Thorough in seeking out potential sources for financial backing. Well, let's see if there's evidence for that in the text. As head of the community center, he went after every existing grant on the city and state level. Well, it would appear that A is the only question that is 100% correct. I'd like you to take a couple minutes, go ahead, finish the rest of these questions if you haven't. Click through and look again at the way the ACT board explains these responses. Keep track of the things you got wrong and why. Great. So before we move on to talking a little bit about writing as best we can, I would like you to make a note that I would like you to complete passage 2 in English and passage 2 in reading if you have not done so already. I did ask last session that you complete those. There's a chance that maybe you haven't gotten to it, so I would like you to absolutely get that done by the next time we get together. We'll be going through some of those specific answers. As you work through those passages, I want you to try to apply note-taking strategies, that passage mapping in the English and the reading, and see if that helps. See if that helps you find the correct answers more quickly on the page. I'd also want you to keep track of the kinds of errors that you might tend to be making so that we can better focus our efforts on sort of the little content, the things about English that are a little bit harder for you. Please feel free to email me those questions ahead of time, and I can answer them at any time for you. So at this point, we're going to jump over to writing. It's really, really important in every portion of the ACT exam, but particularly in writing, to be sure that you read every part of the prompt. We're going to go ahead and read it together, just so that I know that you know the instructions and we're on the same page as far as what we're trying to accomplish. So for this particular sample essay, you are being asked to write a unified, coherent essay about the increasing presence of intelligent machines. In your essay, be sure to clearly state your own perspective on the issue and analyze the relationship between your perspective and at least one other perspective. Break that down a little bit. Clearly state your own perspective on the issue. That means being able to express your opinion, what you think, and then analyze the relationship between your perspective and at least one other perspective. So, in many, many different ways, your opinion will have a relationship to several of the opinions that they will give you. So you'll need to be able to identify whether you are in agreement with one of those perspectives, if you disagree with one of those perspectives, or if it's something a little bit more complicated. So I agree, but I would change this, or I disagree. However, in these ways, I could be brought to agree with this perspective. You'll need to develop and support your ideas with reasoning and examples. So not only be able to use logic to explain why your point of view is what you believe to be correct, but also give specific examples and specific instances when that has proven to be true. The more specific, the better. You should be able to organize your ideas, which is something that you've been practicing, working through English and reading, looking for structure in an essay. So it should be pretty clear why you put your ideas in the order that you did, and then communicate your ideas effectively in standard written English. So to my empowered writers out there, I hate to say it, but this is one case in which you'll have to follow the rules. The ACT is looking for writing that is technically correct. Again, writing that is not redundant, writing that's not overly verbose. So don't repeat yourself. Don't use 27 words when 2 will get the same meaning across. And perhaps steer clear of rhetorical choices. That means choices that you make to communicate your point of view that may be perhaps artistic but less clear. Technically correct is always the best way to go on the ACT. Your perspective may be in full agreement with any of those given, in partial agreement, or completely different. So it's perfectly okay to differ with the perspectives that have been provided to you, as long as you can explain why with logic and examples. Okay. And we'll go through the specific prompt. This sample prompt, Intelligent Machines, is representative of the prompts that will be used for the ACT writing class. So basically they're saying this is an example of what this might look like. The test describes an issue and provides 3 different perspectives on the issue. You are asked to read and consider the issue and perspectives and state your own perspective on the issue and analyze the relationship between your perspective and at least one other perspective on the issue. Again, you don't have to agree, you don't have to disagree, but you do have to explain yourself. Your score will not be affected by the perspective you take on the issue. That said, you'll probably want to choose a perspective that you feel you can defend in a clear and meaningful way. You want to be sure to read the sample prompt itself very carefully. Many of the goods and services we depend on daily are now supplied by intelligent, automated machines rather than human beings. Robots build cars and other goods on assembly lines where once there were human workers. Many of our phone conversations are now conducted not with people, but with sophisticated technologies. We can now buy goods at a variety of stores without the help of a human cashier. Automation is generally seen as a sign of progress, but what is lost when we replace humans with machines? Given the accelerating variety and prevalence of intelligent machines, it's a doozy of a sentence, we'll start it again. Given the accelerating, speeding up, variety and prevalence, lots of different kinds, and a lot of it, period, of intelligent machines, it is worth examining the implications, the potential effects, and the meaning of their presence in our lives. It is much, much, much more useful to clearly understand the prompt before you get started than to jump right into writing and answer the wrong prompt. Because answering the wrong question, even if it's a really well-written essay, will give you a low score. Super, super, super important to understand the prompt. It's okay even if you have to read it 2 times, 3 times. Better to answer the correct question. After reading the prompt, you'll probably have your own idea beginning to formulate about what you have to say, and maybe even some pieces of evidence. It's still a good idea to look at all of the different perspectives to see if there is one that you might more easily align yourself with, that you may not have expected at first. Perspective 1, what we lose with the replacement of people by machines is some part of our own humanity. Even our mundane daily encounters no longer require from us basic courtesy, respect, and tolerance for other people. Perspective 2, machines are good at low-skill, repetitive jobs, and at high-speed, extremely precise jobs. In both cases, they work better than humans. This efficiency leads to a more prosperous and progressive world for everyone. You can see that those two perspectives are at sort of far ends of the continuum. So if you think that it would be easier for you to just agree or disagree, you may want to choose one of those two. Finally, perspective 3, intelligent machines challenge our long-standing ideas about what humans are or can be. This is good because it pushes both humans and machines toward new, unimagined possibilities. The reason that they include 3 is because it's important to be able to write a nuanced argument that's not either black or white, but they want to see that you can deal with kind of complicated ideas in a clear and coherent way. At this point, please take 2 minutes and jot down what you think your perspective is, the other perspective that you'd like to work with, and how you think those things are related. Please pause the video now. Before we start thinking about sample essays, a few pointers on writing persuasive argument. You again will want to be sure to include evidence for every piece of your argument that you would like to make. So you have to defend not only your point of view, but you also have to explain the other point of view and explain how they fit together. Again, sorry to my empowered writers out there. It's wonderful to be able to make your own choices and to think artistically and so forth. Might not be a terrible idea in this case to write a standard 5-paragraph essay, especially if you are grappling with some of the complications involved in the prompt. If you have not written a 5-paragraph essay before, simply introduction, conclusion, and 3 body paragraphs. In this case, you can do what you will with those 3 body paragraphs. Often you will find that your paragraphs include an argument and evidence. Argument and evidence. Counter-argument, where you talk about the other side. Evidence. And a conclusion that wraps it all up. Make sure that your thesis statement addresses all of the points that you plan to make. Using that counter-argument in your 4th paragraph is helpful if you're choosing to disagree with one of the perspectives. But it's not the be-all, end-all, only way to write an essay, and you're not bound by 5 paragraphs either. But it is sometimes helpful to think within that structure. I would highly recommend outlining, at least briefly, a few bullet points your essay before you actually write. Again, just like reading that prompt several times, taking the time to outline will make the writing actually go more quickly for you. So I'd like you to take 5 minutes now, jot down a short outline of what you would like your essay to look like. Pause the video now. All right, and for next time, I would like you to turn that outline into an essay. Please give yourself only about 30 minutes, since we already wrote that outline, to complete that essay. I would like you to send it to inspiredclassroomheather@gmail.com. I can review that for you, talk to you more about it, and I would be so happy to get more into the details of timed essay writing with you based on your experiences. I don't want to repeat anything that you already know, and I also don't want to leave anything out. So please just let me know where you are and what you need. So, for our next session, please finish Passage 2 of English, Passage 2 of Reading, and this sample prompt for the writing portion, the essay portion of the exam. When we get together again, we'll talk about some of the samples and why they received the scores that they did, and we'll put that in the context of your writing as well. Again, if you have any questions about any portion of this session, about anything we'll be talking about, anything specific that you'd like to work with, email me and I can work it into the course. Thank you very much. Hope it helped. Bye.
I know. I had this fearful.
Does it ever get less awkward looking at yourself?